Putin has ruthlessly thrown all his military resources on the table for the 2026 summer offensive. The goal was simple yet devastating: to capture the fortress belt, Ukraine's largest and most impenetrable stronghold in the east. According to ISW reports, the quadrilateral of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Kostiantynivka and Druzhkivka has been at the very heart of Russia's ultimate victory aspirations since the very beginning of the war. Meanwhile, French military analyst Clement Moulin reveals that Russia has kept 3 massive army groups, south, center, and west, on standby since March, waiting for the moment to strike. This buildup represents a staggering force: 18 brigades and 8 divisions, totaling over 100,000 Russian soldiers. The 20th Guards Combined Arms Army was specifically deployed to form the iron backbone of this offensive. The 1st Guards Tank Army, with its heavy steel tracks, stood ready for orders to breach the Pokrovsk direction and shatter the Ukrainian lines. And on the other side, the 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division had already taken position, preparing for a ruthless human wave attack against the Kostiantynivka lines. Russian state television and propaganda machines were loudly declaring that this build-up would wipe the Ukrainian defense in the fortress belt off the map in just a few short weeks. In Moscow, the generals were confident. They were ready to deliver the news of a total victory to Putin himself. But against these flashy and arrogant plans, Kyiv was waiting. Inside the fortress belt, they waited with a silent yet deadly patience. The Ukrainian army had done more than just dig trenches. They had woven a massive web, a web designed to draw the Russians into a strategic pit of their own making. At the very heart of this web stood the elements of the Azov First Corps, armed not just with weapons, but with next-generation warfare tactics. Instead of suicide assaults on the front lines, Azov units lay in ambush. Deep within the fortress belt, they waited like an invisible hand, while the mechanized brigades built a wall of steel on the surface. Azov had established something far more lethal: a digital execution zone in the sky. The Russians were expecting a massive conventional war. But Azov and the Ukrainian brigades had other plans. They were ready to drag the invaders into an entirely new kind of deadlock. Moscow's military power in the fortress belt was actually on the verge of becoming a target, crushed under its own massive weight. The dark days of the old ways, where heavy armor melted away in minefields, are now left behind. With Azov supporting the Ukrainian armed forces in the fortress belt, a new doctrine has emerged. At its heart lies a massive drone network, based on destroying the enemy without ever being seen. At this point, the Azov First Corps has transformed, once an urban warfare legend. It is now the most remarkable technological force of modern warfare. Azov is no longer just an infantry unit fighting street by street. It is a deep strike network, the ultimate nightmare of Russian logistics, hovering over the fortress belt like an invisible hand. Azov operators have established a flawless digital synergy with the mechanized brigades on the front. In secret underground bunkers, the unit's operators direct the war from miles away like a lethal computer game. Monitoring the front line in real time with digital maps, they are rewriting the rules of war. Software engineers and drone pilots serving in Azov headquarters left enemy engineers utterly helpless. By pushing instant software updates against Russian frequencies, they stayed one step ahead, changing their tactics day by day. While the infantry in the trenches withstood the brutal Russian attacks, the drones of Azov were quietly taking off. Their mission: to sever the enemy's lifelines. Deep behind the lines, this unique coordination was only the visible face of the nightmare facing the Russian command. Classical Russian military doctrine relied on gathering massive amounts of ammunition and soldiers in giant hubs, transporting them to the front via railways. But Azov had found the weakest point of this cumbersome structure. In the final 30-kilometer death zone, where trains could not reach, the Russian army was left dependent on unarmored and defenseless KAMAZ trucks. And this is exactly where Azov's true grand strategy in the fortress belt began. They deliberately avoided entering a direct pitched battle, aiming instead to sever the Russian unit's logistical arteries in the region. This patient and deadly tactic marked the first steps of a process that would fundamentally shake Russia's entire war machine. Without the fuel and ammunition that gave them life, massive armored columns and heavy artillery batteries meant nothing. They were nothing more than giant piles of iron left to rust on the field. Azov's tactic effectively neutralized billions of dollars worth of equipment by destroying Russia's war economy on logistical routes rather than depleting it on the front lines. The biggest trump card in this unit's hand was the Hornet kamikaze drones, equipped with AI target recognition systems and boasting a staggering 160-kilometer range. Thanks to Starlink integration, these technological marvels glided toward their targets, completely unaffected by the blinding waves of Russian electronic warfare. Hanging in the sky for hours with loitering munition tactics, the Hornets waited. They waited with great composure for the most vulnerable moment of the Russian convoys. The artificial intelligence of the Hornet drones sifted through the noise. It identified vehicles hidden even under camouflage nets by their thermal signatures. It locked specifically onto the engine blocks of fuel tankers. When a single Hornet struck an ammunition truck, with the high explosives it carried, the resulting chain reaction was absolute. It practically wiped an entire Russian convoy off the map. Multi-million-dollar Russian electronic warfare systems, the Krasuka 4 and Pol-21, were left virtually helpless. Against the encrypted frequency-hopping software used by Azov, they stood no chance. Hovering in the air, these digital hunters roamed the sky like absolute ghosts. Their cross-sectional area was too small for Russian air defense radars to detect. They were there, yet they were invisible. Although the Azov First Corps did not conduct direct ground assaults using these systems, it rewrote the fate of the war from the rear echelon. The targets were not so much the Russian soldiers themselves, but rather the ammunition depots, fuel tankers, and food convoys that kept those soldiers alive. The Russian supply lines, stretching specifically along the Yampil, Stavki, and Druzhkivka axis, turned into a veritable open shooting range for Azov drones. Every single Russian truck trying to transport ammunition to the front was stopped in seconds by a fireball descending from the sky. Russian drivers trying to advance on these routes were forced to navigate in pitch darkness at night, unable to even turn on their headlights. However, for Azov's night vision-equipped night hunters, this only made their jobs easier. The wreckage of struck trucks blocked the roads, forcing the vehicles coming from behind to a halt. Many of the Russian drivers preferred to leave their vehicles intact and flee into the forests on foot. His continuous logistical barrier created an incredible breathing space for the Ukrainian troops at point zero of the front line. With Azov support, Ukraine's mechanized units found Russian battalions left without ammunition and morale as they retook the southern sector of Yampil. This state of paralysis in the rear turned the Russian offensive force on the front lines into a paper tiger. Russian commanders whose logistical networks had been rendered unusable could not even provide artillery support to their troops. What happened to the Russian 1st Donetsk Army Corps was a lesson in logistical disaster fit to be taught in military academies. Starting in April 2026, the swarm drone attacks launched by Azov on the Donetsk Ring Road completely severed the jugular vein of this corps. The routes of Zhurivka, Andriivka, and Staromyorsk virtually turned into an open-air museum where Russian logistics vehicles were on display. Ammunition shipments halted, rotations were cancelled, and the 1st Donetsk Army Corps could not step out of its own trenches. These operations severely shook not only logistics, but also the fighting will of the Russian soldiers. Breakdowns began among the Russian soldiers, waiting helplessly in their trenches for days. Russian infantrymen were experiencing a psychological collapse, far more from the lack of rations and medical supplies failing to arrive from the rear than from the Ukrainian resistance they faced on the front. Russian soldiers, unable to receive support from their own headquarters, were forced to retreat. Azov's deadly touch also slowed down the Russian advance in the Pokrovsk sector to a certain extent. As Ukrainian military expert Viktor Kevliuk noted, the Russians became completely bogged down in the mud near Hernik while trying to approach the fortress belt from the south. The logistical routes the Russians relied on to advance had to pass through the rubble-filled ruins of Mariinka and Pokrovsk, and these narrow passages created perfect ambush points for Azov drones. The 1st Guards Tank Army had started its engines to launch a massive armored assault in the direction of Pokrovsk. However, Azov's relentless day and night FPV and Hornet strikes destroyed the convoys carrying fuel to these tanks, miles behind the lines. Deprived of fuel, the multi-ton Russian tanks turned into open targets in the middle of the mud and the terrain. Vital routes like the Tiho 509 and M14 were now no different than a one-way suicide ticket for Russian drivers. Every intersection, every bridge, and every forest road was under the pressure of Azov drones. The Russian command was forced to sacrifice dozens of its soldiers and vehicles just to deliver a single liter of fuel to the front. These unsustainable military losses condemned the massive Russian offensive on the Pokrovsk axis to stall for weeks, while seas of mud left over from harsh winter conditions locked the tracks of massive Russian armor. The rain of FPVs falling from the sky instantly turned these iron piles into fireballs. Abandoned T-90 tanks reduced the morale of the Russian infantry on the front lines to zero, while pushing the self-confidence of the Ukrainian troops to its peak. The same situation applied to the Sivas-Kramatorsk axis further north. The The Russian 3rd Motor Rifle Division stationed here became unable to take a single step due to a lack of supplies and was pinned in place. The desperation of the 20th Guards Combined Arms Army in the direction of Lyman and Sloviansk was also exactly a result of this strategy, turning the land into a living hell by launching more than 800 airstrikes on the region throughout May. The Russians were simply unable to advance their ground troops because the pressure created by Azov in the rear echelon was preventing those critical artillery shells needed by the Russian infantry from reaching the front. The 42nd Guards Motor Rifle Division and its subordinate 71st and 291st Regiments were practically trapped inside a circle. From the front, they were crashing into Ukraine's fortified defense lines, and from the rear, they were becoming targets of Azov's merciless drone swarms. Caught between these two fires, the Russian units suffered massive casualties and were dragged into a tactical deadlock. The Russian generals had become entirely blinded in managing the massive military force at their disposal. This was because Azov primarily hunted down Russian mobile communication nodes and signal jammers, severely impacting the chain of command. Officers, unable to issue orders to trenches miles away from their headquarters, could do nothing but blindly send their soldiers into the deadly Ukrainian crossfire. In the moments when radio communication broke off, coordination between different Russian units dropped completely to zero, and panicking batteries were rendered ineffective. This communication chaos turned an offensive supposedly managed with grand strategy on the front line into a completely blind fight for survival. In other words, the fortress belt trap that Putin had set with high hopes had entered the process of turning into a massive black hole, swallowing his very own army. While planning to break the Ukrainian lines, the Kremlin had actually trapped its own massive army in the middle of what felt like a logistical desert. So, what kind of choice did the Kremlin's military echelon make at this point? The Russian armed forces were forced to divide their resources in panic and deploy them in different directions to stop this bleeding on the front. Electronic warfare systems were pulled from the front line and shifted to the rear to protect logistical routes. However, this desperate move left the Russian infantry on the front completely defenseless against Ukrainian FPV drones. Azov's invisible hand had knocked over all the Russian pieces on the chessboard and begun to completely reshape the game according to Ukraine's rules. The Kostiantynivka clearing operation in February 2026 was a small but flawless rehearsal of this new strategy. In that operation, which lasted 21 days, Azov flawlessly blended FPV drones and infantry tactics, collapsing the Russian resistance from the inside. Cornered deep in the forest, and unable to even raise their heads due to the drones buzzing above them for days, 18 Russian soldiers were helplessly forced to raise the white flag once their ammunition ran out and they were exhausted from starvation. This small-scale psychological collapse was actually characterized as a microscopic reflection of a much larger crushing defeat that would be experienced all along the fortress belt line. And now, the same strategy was being applied on a massive scale, all across the fortress belt. This surprise tactic that Ukraine built on deep strikes and frontline defense rendered Russia's numerical superiority largely meaningless. Those who experienced this reality in the most bitter way were the Russian infantrymen left without commanders and support on the front. Substituting sheer force with sharp intelligence and high technology, the Ukrainian army was writing an epic of resistance that would go down in military history. The Azov First Corps might not have directly liberated a village or town, but their invisible signature was behind every Ukrainian victory on the front. The slowing down and subsequent partial halting of all these logistical lines went down in the records as the most vital move that radically changed the mathematics of the war. This strategic fiasco was the clearest proof that Moscow could not win 21st century wars with massive armies and old Soviet doctrines. In short, the fortress belt turned into a massive pit where Russia's most elite units melted away and vanished, rather than a gateway to victory. Ukraine's incredible resistance and Azov's flawless drone network created the opportunity to irreversibly change the course of the war. It was no longer about who had more soldiers on the battlefield, but who could set their enemy's backyard on fire faster. That was winning. This ruthless war of attrition, lasting for months, ultimately dragged Russia into a process of depleting its strategic reserves. And now, holding its breath, the world is watching how the largest armored siege in history was demolished by a silent and deadly technology from the sky. From this point forward, it seems truly quite difficult for Russia to regain the initiative it lost in the fortress belt, following this massive logistical and strategic collapse in the region. Moscow has a few painful options before it, which are becoming increasingly difficult to execute. In order to climb out of this digital abyss it has fallen into, The Russian command echelon will need to completely abandon old Soviet military dogmas and adapt to the new reality. But this is indeed very difficult, because while the Kremlin is experiencing massive problems in deploying soldiers to the front lines on the one hand, it is facing the loss of military resources on the other, and with each passing day, these losses are increasing exponentially. Currently, there is talk of over 1 million troop casualties. With this many casualties, the Kremlin's expectations for a counterattack on the fortress belt might not go quite as desired. However, Putin still holds a fearsome military power in his hands, because the Russian side is actually applying intense pressure on Ukraine regarding missile and drone strikes. However, these attacks generally target civilian areas ruthlessly in key cities like Kyiv. Ukraine, on the other hand, has found a way to completely corner the Russian army with small but effective operations in strategic locations. Just as in the fortress belt, small successes, meanwhile, are on the verge of compounding over time to reach a level that could change the course on the front lines. Kyiv is aware of this situation, but what about Moscow? The final state of Putin's army in the fortress belt appears to be highly critical. How will over 100,000 Russian soldiers, their logistical veins completely severed in the massive fortress belt, escape this circle of death? Will the Kremlin accept this technological helplessness of its army and give the order to retreat, or will it abandon them to their own fate in this region? The answers to these questions will likely show us what could unfold in the fortress belt as time progresses. Make sure to subscribe to the Military Report for more breaking Russia-Ukraine war news, insights, and analysis. Thank you for watching.